today we have Lauren Barney again. Lauren, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Chelsea. It's great to be here.
So, just real quick for everyone that is new or returning to the podcast, Lauren is a leading China expert and former foreign affairs officer at the U.S. Department of State. She was also previously a security fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy and a contractor at the State Department's Office of China Coordination. So, always use express or her own, but super excited to have your expertise. So, today I know that you're working on certain articles. You've been writing a few things. Given the events that are going on in the world, everyone is talking about US Iran, Israel relationships, US China relationships, but no one is talking about China Israel relationships, which you have unique insight on.
I find it really fascinating, at least in the US, there's definitely a small contingent within the Israel policy expert community that is very fixated on the Far East in general, and then China specifically. And there's think tanks that devote full staff to it. But for the US, we're such a strong ally and one that we are fighting a war operations with. You would think that there'd be more discourse here. I'm actually excited to delve into things today and talk about certain perspectives, maybe also just from like the Jewish perspective, Jewish American perspective. There's so many angles we can take this. So happy to go whichever way you want.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, it's not my area of expertise, but from what I've heard in conversations, kind of giving my understanding, it's people will talk about the US Israel relationship or US China relationship. And then, obviously, like you said, think tanks over in the Middle East will focus more on the direct relationship with China, but here, not so much. Whereas I did also notice that when I was in China, I think we can start a more personal note before we take it up to the whole international level. But when I was traveling there, I noticed that there wasn't, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I was surprised to see that there were mosques in certain areas, but that's more tied to minorities in China. And then there was also, I met a few, people in synagogues there, but it didn't seem like Chinese people had huge anti-Semitic views, where I've encountered that in other countries, like in Europe or the United States. What's your view on kind of like the Jewish presence either in China or China towards Jews?
So I'm by no means a historian. I can talk from personal experience and then
Yeah.
also just my general understanding of the history and where everything's kind of gone. So essentially, before communist China, especially if you go back to the Silk Road, where a lot of merchants were traveling, right? And there were a lot of Jewish merchants. A lot of them ended up in Kaifeng. So we know that there's a older, much older community from Kaifeng in northern China. And then you also have kind of the communities that were there temporarily. You had like a Russian Jewish community in Harbin who built a synagogue there. They were fleeing Russian persecution usually or seeking economic opportunity in Manchuria. And then you had kind of like another wave during the Holocaust. The Japanese saved a lot of Jews through Shanghai. So you had a big community in Shanghai during World War II and then a little bit beyond. And I've met a lot of Americans whose parents were saved that way, who then immigrated to America. And so there's rich history and interactions with Jews, but there wasn't really necessarily ancient interactions with Jews. I've been debating with some about whether Confucius would have even had access, saying no, but he did. If you read the Analects and other works by Confucius, you see that there's a lot of similarities in values. Maybe it's just ancient values. So there's a lot of like underpinning of ancient agricultural society that I could get into, and it's super fascinating to me, but I'll leave it there between, the Jewish community and the Chinese community in ancient China. But if you come more to modern times, I would say that there's a lot of the stereotypes that Jews experience worldwide and that usually are anti Semitic tropes are philo Semitic within China. So that means that something that I hadn't experienced anywhere in the world, to be honest, before traveling to China was this idea of philo-Semitism, where all these ideas of Jews being very wealthy, very smart, very successful, those tropes that are usually used for anti-Semitism there were almost admired, and you were put on a pedestal as if there was something great about the Jewish culture beyond any other culture. Unfortunately, with the war and after October 7th in Israel, there's been kind of like this shift that has been permeating through Chinese culture or Chinese social media, I would say mostly, and Douyin and Weibo, essentially saying that Jews are controlling the media and Jews are controlling the banks and all of that. And it's turning anti Semitic now and going unfettered. I think personally, I find it very concerning that I don't think it's really permeated all of society. I still think almost every Jewish person I know that's traveled to China has a story of getting in a cab and the cab driver asking where you're from and finding out you're Jewish and then saying, "Oh, I'm Handsome, like you're very smart." But I don't know if it's permeated that part of society yet. I'm excited to hopefully travel back one day and see, but I do see it changing, and it's just a natural progression. If you ask a lot of historians, and I met some of them through the State Department, and they will say that there's that natural progression from anti-Semitism, philo-Semitism to anti-Semitism. I think that also kind of impacts, if we want to move to the international relations topics, that sort of impacts how China and Israel work together and where the US fits into that. So I think from my work, the biggest thing that I saw was the tech competition, and also from the economic side, the market flooding that China does, the low cost items into every market, including the US, right? But in our market, that's almost a net positive, I would say. I could probably debate a lot of different people on that. You probably have your own views. But in Israel and also in some of the Gulf states, kind of like the Taobao or the Temu, like what we have here, Temu, um, and those websites, AliExpress, they're much easier for Israelis to use than Amazon. And a lot of them are getting a lot of their goods from AliExpress and all of that. So I think that there's a lot of low cost items flooding the market and competing with Israeli products. And so that can be an issue long term in terms of relations if China's cracking down a little bit. I think the two other areas, I would say that there's the highest economic cooperation or economic prospects for China-Israeli relations would be the tech sector. Like everywhere in the world, Israel, everyone's trying to get into the best tech, find the best tech, and Israel definitely has most of it, a lot of it. And so, especially in cybersecurity and the underpinnings of AI, I'm not so fluent in the software. Maybe you're better than that topic than I am. But there's definitely China's definitely trying to, just like they're using American kind of underpinnings of software and whatnot to power their AI models, they're doing the same thing with the Israelis. And so I think that's somewhere where the US and Israel can work closely on trying to mitigate any negative factors that might come out of that. And then finally, I think that you have the general political issues of China, Israel. So you're going to have Israeli desire to comment on Taiwan and be an open, free, democratic society with free speech. I think recently the Jerusalem Post, which is the English newspaper in Israel, posted an article on Taiwan. And you see right away China going into its general image control, where it asks usually the Chinese embassy, usually it's the ambassador even. And we see this across Africa. We've seen it across the Middle East and all different countries publishing op-eds in response to something or an article in that country or an action in that country that undermines the Chinese talking points on Taiwan. And they're trying to flood the general consciousness of society in the third country in order to influence essentially like a whole information's op. And so we saw that think it was as recently as like 2 days ago in the Jerusalem
Yeah.
Post. So there's those issues. And yeah, I think there's a lot that Israel can do with the US. And I think we need to start with tech. I think that that's the biggest vulnerability. And then, of course, as we spoke about in the last podcast, if you look at Iran as well, we can get a little into that. But I think Iran needs a lot of support from China and in this war. And we can see that when China's not involved militarily at all or less involved overtly, it's much harder for Israel to maneuver. And once they're much more overtly helping Iran, it's going to make it a lot easier for Israel to push back. But I don't think that China wants or should get involved in the sense of making it a China Iran versus US Israel kind of bipolar situation. And I think that that would actually hurt everyone involved even more than already.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fascinating what I think Israel was the first country in the Middle East to recognize the People's Republic of China when it,
Yeah.
was officially founded. And then so, clearly there was good relationships before. I know that like my grandparents, before they escaped the Soviet bloc Hungary, their backup plan if they didn't go to the West was to escape into China. My family's not Jewish, but
Yeah.
it's, we still felt the ramifications of World War II and everything that was involved with that. But I mean, up to the international level, it's like you really laid out well a lot of the different areas where China's having increasing influence in kind of Israel's neighborhood. It's like you mentioned, I remember when I was a full-time journalist, I was watching them build out, supply chain lines going over to the Middle East, to Eastern Europe, through to Central Europe, so forth, so on. Uh, but I think, again, just technology, like you said, is going to be one of the main issues. I mean, Israel is one of the most advanced in that sector. Clearly, there's so many collaborations between the US and Israel on that topic. I do think we do run the risk of this becoming type of a proxy, not a conflict. I don't want to attach any legal
Mhm.
titles, a proxy issue between the US and China. I guess I'm wondering, do you think, obviously, the US and Israel have gotten a lot more closer over the last few months in terms of military ties, strategic agreements, and even just obviously action in the Middle East. Do you think that China would have this evolving contentious view towards Israel if it wasn't as closely tied with the US? Do you think that's the main issue? I mean, because from the outside, that's kind of what it seems like to me, but I'm not sure if that's the right take.
Yeah, I don't think that that has so much. I mean, obviously it looms large, but I think it's more of that China knows that Israel is never gonna leave the US side. I think it comes down more, at least from the US perspective on Israel, than I could give what I think would be the Israeli perspective. I think from the US perspective, it's probably rooted in the idea of democracy and that we are both democratic states, the US and Israel. And therefore, because the US and Israel are democratic states, there's a natural partnership there and allyship, and there's a need to protect freedom. You can already see with the way the AI models are going, there's not going to be much freedom in the AI. If there's a China led AI system or a China led tech system, and there's also no rules in terms of intellectual property protection and things of that nature. And also just the idea, I mean, it's not a perfect market system, right? But the idea that China or that Israel is going to use more of a free market economic system, especially in the tech world, I think that that's vital in terms of US Israel cooperation. But our partnership is also very, very deep, right? Going back decades. I mean, I think that that's what's kind of missing from a lot of the rhetoric nowadays is this whole idea of kind of the US at the helm or the US kind of as, in the I think it's almost like an anti-Semitic trope of the US being in Israel's clause in the US policy or that US is kind of at the beck and call of Israel, and that's what dragged us into the war. And I think that that's kind of like this idea that we could be puppets of Israel, whereas like there's a lot of goals in the war or operation, whatever they would call it, and that there's lots to do together and work on together. And so I think that the amount of intelligence that we're able to share between the two countries, the amount of values that are shared, that means a lot in terms of US foreign policy. So I think that that is going to continue. The other part that I would say is super important in terms of like Israel-China relations or from the Israeli perspective is that there is a desire to work more with China. BYD, for instance, like the electric vehicles, they're running rampant across the Middle East and the world, right? I think it just
Mhm.
surpassed Tesla. And Israel was one of the first like Middle Eastern markets that it went into. And there even I think that there's an understanding from the Israeli society that that could be an issue if all the cars on a grid are connected to a Chinese system, essentially. At the same time, the tech was cheaper and more desired. And I think that that kind of also works with what we were talking about earlier with AliExpress, that they're going to use this, Israel's going to use the system that gives them the cheapest options, the most market access. And I think that that's a little bit where the economics and security kind of rival one another. And I think China needs, just like the rest of the world to some degree, Israeli tech or wants Israeli tech because it's the best. Most countries are not going to say we don't want it because of whatever political or military affiliations that they have. And so I think China's kind of the same way. And like I said, I think it goes back to that philo-Semitism that at the end of the day, there's a deep respect for the ancient societies, and although their outright rhetoric in China is very pro-Arab, very much political rhetoric repeats Arab talking points, I think at the end of the day, there is that push and pull, and they're going to also not necessarily focus on the I think essentially they need Israel a lot more than they need Iran. And so I think at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, even if it's more quiet, China and Israel will have to work together a little bit more. And I think that the role for the US in that is to think about how we can work with Israel as a close partner to mitigate any negative issues that, we have an economic relationship with China. It's not fair and does not make much sense when you have one of the biggest markets in the world to ask any partner to shut themselves off from that market. And so I think that we need to find the right balance and how to protect, just like we're trying to protect ourselves in the US, we can share those best learned practices with our allies and partners like Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because that FCC just imposed 301 on China. Let me just pull it up so I have it immediately. Do, do, do. Yeah, so there were essentially more restrictions on Chinese testing laboratories, drones, routers, so forth, so on, robots. And then China just responded with sanctions on the US as well. But within that, I mean, even though there's this conflict, there are no sanctions on Israel in the same regard. So I do think that there still is that interest in operation technology. I guess I want to get to the Taiwan point also, but speaking a little bit more on technology, obviously, yes, the market's been very receptive of BYD for its innovative technology as well as cost. I guess, China is pretty well known for being very good at researching models and borrowing and adopting IP. So, from kind of the Israeli side, do you see any concerns perhaps of technology, IP theft? Or realistically, could you see Israel and China collaborating on technology? Because there are use cases for it, but there are also a lot of dual technologies and some issues.
I mean, my hot take would be I wouldn't collaborate at all with China if I was Israel. I think you and I both know that BYD might be a good product. I'm not sure the underpinnings of it or the car life or how great their battery systems are. I assume that they're pretty on par with Tesla, but I haven't done enough research or spoken to enough experts on those issues. But what I would say with BYD is we know that the only way they were able to keep their costs so low is through market subsidies, unfair practices from China. And we've seen this time and time again. I do think that Israel maybe could collaborate on a lot, but I would be too fearful of the dual use of almost every technology. I've seen examples where China might take something as benign as like a healthcare tech and kind of weaponize it. I think that seeing something like that would make me a little weary, but I do think that Israel really does do a lot in tech innovation, especially pharmaceuticals, different biomedical engineering products. So I think something like that where it's for the real good of the world and something where maybe China and their humanoid robot breakthroughs that are occurring, maybe those two could pair together to make a really good arm prosthetic or something. But I really do think that there's like, I think that that goes back though to a fundamental question, right? Like that there's, like not everything. I think with China in general, we either have in Washington the China hawks or the panda huggers. And you don't really need to be either. That there has to be nuance and there has to be something that we can do. That not everything has to be nefarious, and that there could be a net positive. The question is, well, how can we create those positives without the dual use negatives? I I don't have a good answer yet. I think that it's gonna be a long time, but I'm pretty weary about everything. I feel like it's kind of like that one kid in school where you're like, "I don't know what they're gonna do next, but I'm gonna be their friend just so that I'm not on the wrong s." Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's always good to treat people well. So I'm similarly minded with you. Last time I was in China, I went to some car factories and they talked about the shining specs and everything. But the entire time I was there, and this isn't to discredit Chinese engineering or innovation at all. I remember, I don't know when the first time you were in China was, but I remember first time I was in China was 2008, and then I was there longer in 2010, 2012, 2013. I remember meeting all the Germans, the BMW, everyone was in Beijing at the time or in Shanghai, and there was a lot of manufacturing. But I remember thinking, why are all the car people here? And at the time, it was great for facilitating learning on the Chinese part, which they took and ran with, which is great. I will say one thing that China really excels in terms of technology is when they meet barriers, issues, supply chain, or just any real barriers, they're very good at innovating around those barriers and adopting new technologies. I mean, we see that with energy and semiconductors right now in terms of creative workarounds when there are restrictions in place. So I will say they excel at that. But then in health tech, the other thing was I visited some bio labs last time and also spoke with a cancer. I don't know if it was a nonprofit, but they were using essentially lots of screening results and leveraging AI to assess that in cancer patients. And because it's China, at first they had to overcome kind of trust issues in giving health information. But once there were education programs and more diffused across all communities, party workers, they were able to collect a lot of data. And then because of that, they were able to train the AI algorithm to target it way more efficiently and than a human eye could in terms of testing for cancer, which yielded really promising results. And then I know that they exported that a bit, I forget which one, but to some African countries as well. So with that in mind, I could see them potentially. So I do see them where they could potentially collaborate with Israel on say health biohealth products innovations there. That would make sense to me. Anyway, okay. Back to the story though. But then also I'm curious if we can wrap up with one or two more questions. I guess what's your take in terms of I mean, you mentioned Taiwan. I did see that China responded to that. It's obviously a sensitive issue. What is the Israeli government's take on Taiwan? I mean, you talked about democracy and everything, but I mean, this is just more recently that I've seen it become, a talking point between Israel and China.
Yeah, I think like most countries that are trying to deal with the Taiwan issue, um, varying degrees of, how they respond. There's varying degrees of how they respond based on both values and kind of the society at large. So I think because Israel does have a lot of Western influence, it doesn't necessarily see the Taiwan question as they wanna support democracy, I believe. I think that they understand, though, that China, that Taiwan is a like, province. They can understand the Chinese perspective, and they do have formal relations with China, diplomatic relations. So, I think just like any other country, there is this ambiguity. That being said, I think that I've seen a lot of places where people try to draw parallels between the Israeli-Palestinian our Arab-Israeli conflict and Taiwan and China, and I think that for those parallels, as if they see kind of like Taiwan as the Palestinians, there's a lot of conversation like that, and I think that something like that doesn't really translate into Israeli society, and it's not a good kind of example, I would think, but I think that, you know, there's a lot that mm, China or a lot that Taiwan could actually learn from the Palestinians in almost like in an asymmetric warfare, how to inflict the most damage. And so I think that there's a lot of tension there in terms of how much should Taiwan really depend on help from Western countries. It's unlike, if there's conversation of arms sales, I think, right? Like that's a big deal for the US. I think Israel's far behind on those conversations, I would say, at least publicly. I'll have to go back to my Israeli experts on that, but I do think that there's also a lot that Israel could give to Taiwan in terms of understanding how to respond to mass casualty events, understanding how to set up different kind of like mass communications in asymmetric environments and in a small landmass. Things like that, tactically, militarily, strategically, they could really share with one another. Whether Israel will ever do that formally, I highly doubt it because of their relationship with China. So I think that there's like a lot of influence there still. But I do think that, just like everywhere else, there's across the West, and even in the Middle East, let's be honest, all the Arab countries to the Gulf countries, everyone would probably, I would assume, based on my experience and, just living in the world, that most people want to keep the Taiwan Strait as an international shipping lane. And so I think that it's in the global interest to do that. And so I do think that if there was ever some sort of kinetic activity there or a blockade of some sort or some action, that there would be a need for a lot of the world to step in different capacities. And I don't know what that would look like, but the hope is that we just never get to that point and that world peace. Yeah. But yeah, I think Israel in terms I think the Israel in terms of Taiwan in general, I think that they're always gonna kinda have the strategic ambiguity that we have as they kinda define their policy a little bit more because a lot of countries, like, Israel's not that I mean, America's not that old compared to a lot of countries, but Israel really isn't. So, it's only 75 years, 70 so it's gonna even more time to kinda develop a more robust policy and kind of that foreign policy community on China is relatively small to begin with. So even just understanding and grappling with an issue as complicated as the Taiwan Strait, I think they're not gonna it's gonna take a little bit more time. I think, though, what's really interesting to me and something that we should definitely explore for in a future podcast is kind of China's approach to middle powers and where that's headed. And I think that they're starting to see themselves as like a bigger global player. And if China sees itself as a bigger global player, then what does that mean? And how should these middle powers work together? I mean, and Israel, Singapore, even maybe Japan, those could be really strong alliances one day. And if you're talking about tech, like Israel, Korea, there's a lot that could be done to kind of create a robust world. And is China tapping into those global markets and creating that market, or is the US tapping in? And how does that work? It's just like future for that.
The issues that were
Oh,
there's a lot of, yeah, like the middle powers and tech. So really fun. We can do another day on that. There is a lot going
I
on
can
for sure.
interview you.
I think interesting. I mean, besides looking at the political perspective at Taiwan and having democratic practices under a what's the exact terminology again? The two party one thing. What is it? Do you remember? My brain is blanking for
Oh,
China and Taiwan.
oh, for China and Taiwan, the one
It's the
China
classics.
policy, the
Yeah,
one
one
China
China.
policy, US.
No,
Oh,
it's
you're saying for
like
Hong Kong, the one China, two systems.
yeah, so like same for Taiwan, like yeah, one
Yeah.
China, two systems. Yeah, my brain was just blanking. But yeah, I remember that was one of the first ways I got into China issues was going to Taiwan, seeing I remember at the time I didn't understand the import of it, but seeing all the technology as well as the semiconductor facilities, also with, legacy post, invasion, Japan, Formosa, that type of thing. So I wouldn't be shocked if there's agreements with Israel there as commercial sense. But yeah, we should definitely build more of that
And I
podcast,
will
I guess.
say one last thing on
Uh,
that too, like for Israel, they're having major elections coming up very soon. So how we didn't even touch on that, but how their domestic politics might shape kind of, I think it will stay similar how they approach these issues, but they might, if Netanyahu doesn't win, there's going to
mhm.
be a very new political actor at the helm of the prime minister's office. So you're going to have to, figure out there too, kind of these new policies and where it will shape out and how much will be prioritized in the middle of a war. I don't know, but yeah, that's more food for thought.
No, I was actually going to bring that up. So I'm glad you brought it up because I was curious. Netanyahu was holding down the office for quite a bit, probably the longest tenors, sources of power in Israel that I'm aware of, at least. Do you think realistically he could be out of office?
I feel like Israeli society change. I feel like their politics change weekly or daily, even sometimes. And I think that there is a real possibility. You have to remember there were massive protests out. I think that what works for Netanyahu is that whenever there's security issues, like the war, obviously that's going to help his party and him a little bit more because there's that fear mongering that plays out well for the more right side, but of the of Israeli politics, but the economics aren't great, right? Like they have the same domestic issues that we have. They have the kitchen table issues as well. So depending on how that all plays out in Israel, and then also I think like there were massive protests before October 7th. Even now, sometimes there's protests. I haven't been following it so closely, but there's a lot of disdain for Netanyahu, especially among the left. And so the question is how much of the right will go towards candidate. The polling suggests that Likud's down. Netanyahu's party, but very thin margins. So we'll just have to see as things that I wouldn't bet on the US elections, and I definitely, definitely would not bet on the Israeli ones. But I also think what's really interesting about Netanyahu is his political arc. He started out, right, like he was a very different candidate and a very different leader in some sense during his first tenure. And then when he came back to Israel, like to the prime minister's as the prime minister, he took on more of this to the right role and his coalition included the ultra orthodox or parties and all of these different issues kind of that were in there before are very prominent now. And I think anyone who's read anything in the past year on Israeli society, and something that's really deep there right now is the draft for the ultra orthodox into the Israeli Defense Forces. And so I think that that is really what's at the forefront of Israeli politics right now. And so that's going to affect very deeply the outcome of the election very deeply as well. And so I think that we have a lot more time until seeing how this war with Iran continues, and kind of if the reservists are being called up, that's going to affect a lot of the more right wing voters as well in Israel. So yeah, it's going to be a whole process. But I think China playing, I wonder, and we should also get into this another time, but kind of like China influence ops in the US and in our social media. I wonder how they might try to push an election in Israel, how much they even really care, to be honest. They'll probably have a very similar, I think China's approach to Israel will be very similar no matter who's at the helm office. So yeah, should be interesting, the government.
Oh my gosh, there's lots to watch.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think that's a good place to start since it gives us something to look forward to in terms of watching potential outcomes and also future episodes.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining this week, Lauren. And yes, definitely, I think for our next episode, we can do Middle Powers Friday Fun Day. So
Yes.
make sure to tune. But yes, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me.